Welcome, everyone. I'm so excited to introduce our speaker this morning, Dr. Amy Moore. Dr. Amy is a cognitive psychologist, clinical researcher, board-certified Christian counselor, TEDx speaker, host of the Brainy Moms podcast, an ADHD mom, and a mom with ADHD. She is the director of research for LearningRx in Colorado Springs, Colorado, at the headquarters of the largest network of cognitive training centers in the world. Her groundbreaking neuroplasticity research has been published in peer-reviewed medical and psychology journals and presented at conferences around the country. She has a master's degree in education, a PhD in psychology, and 30 years of experience working with children and families. Please help me give a warm welcome to Dr. Amy Moore.
You guys have energy this morning. I just broke my Starbucks addiction. It was kind of an amazing transition, and so the problem is, this is the first presentation that I've done where I'm not jacked up on 3 sugar-free vanilla brevets. So we're gonna go on iced tea and some homemade coffee at home this morning and see how it goes. So this presentation is called Hacking the ADHD Brain. And I like to get to know my audience a little before I start talking. So how many of you have children with ADHD? How many of you have ADHD? How many of you work with ADHD? So you teach them, you work in a clinical setting. What does that look like? Anyone? What kind of setting do you work in? Brain training. Well, you're gonna love this presentation then. Well, here's the cool part. This is actually for all of those categories. This is for parents who have ADHD kids. This is for teachers and clinicians who work with people with ADHD. And this presentation is for people like me who have ADHD themselves. So Dr. Jody gave you my bio, so I'm not going to spend any time going over this slide. But what I want to draw your attention to is that I am an ADHD mom and a mom with ADHD. So in addition to being a psychologist and a clinical researcher in ADHD, this topic is so near and dear to my heart because I live it all day, every day. So this is an example of my ADHD. My brain is like an internet browser. I have 76 tabs open, 3 of them are frozen, and I have no idea where the music is coming from. In reality, I have 2 browsers open with 76 tabs each. And here's another way. Either I can't focus on anything, or I just spent the last 2 hours watching videos about fainting goats and can't remember what I was originally doing. Can anyone with ADHD relate? Absolutely. So here's what I'm going to talk about today. There are surprising differences between an ADHD brain and a non-ADHD brain. And I'm going to show you images of the brain that demonstrate those differences. And then I'm going to talk about 5 things that influence ADHD symptoms. But first, I want to play a game. I'm going to tell you a story, and then a little bit later, I'm going to ask you a question about that story. So you need to remember the details. Are you ready? Yes. Okay. A monkey named Jefferson was sitting in a tree above the beach eating bananas. He dropped one of the bananas and it landed on a jellyfish. A seagull swooped in, saved the jellyfish, and ate the banana. Okay, so this is the ADHD iceberg. Above the water is what we typically think of when we think of ADHD. We think of inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. In fact, those are the diagnostic categories. But look at how much is happening underneath the water. Things that we can't see, things that seem invisible but manifest in a variety of behavioral ways. So things like poor relationships, inability to regulate emotions, poor memory, sometimes low self-esteem, difficulty following conversations, being unaware of our own behaviors. Can you relate to those things under the water? So the brain with ADHD is different. And I'm going to show you multiple ways. And the reason that I show this is because I want to build empathy. I want to build empathy that you have for kids that you have with ADHD or that you work with ADHD. But I also want to build compassion for yourself if you have it. Because when you can see the difference between an ADHD brain and a non-ADHD brain, you begin to go, oh, that makes so much sense. That's why I struggle. So this is a SPECT scan that measures blood flow throughout the brain. And so those white circles on the right in the ADHD brain show decreased blood flow to the prefrontal cortex in the ADHD brain, where you don't see that in the non-ADHD brain. This is a quantitative EEG that compares an ADHD brain to a non-ADHD brain during a cognitive task. And what you see in the ADHD brain is this hyperconnectivity, this exaggerated communication and interaction among brain areas that you don't see in the non-ADHD brain. This is a functional MRI scan of connections to the frontal lobe. And we know that that prefrontal cortex is the CEO of the brain, where we think and we reason and we plan. And so you can see that the non-ADHD brain has a beautiful connection with the prefrontal cortex, but the ADHD brain does not. See this right here? So another way to demonstrate this is through a math equation. So you can see that the non-ADHD brain, whoops, sorry about that. This is what happens when you have two controllers. You have to remember which one does what. Okay, so this is a non-ADHD brain with beautiful connections. This is actually the default mode network. And this is the ADHD brain, where you don't see the connections with the prefrontal cortex. And so these are the differences in a math equation. And this is another way to visualize that. You can see the beautiful connections, correlations with the prefrontal cortex in the non-ADHD brain, where it's nearly absent with the ADHD brain. And finally, this is a PET scan. This measures our brain's ability to use glucose for energy. And so you can see higher glucose metabolism in the non-ADHD brain. It's able to use glucose for energy, where you don't see that in the ADHD brain. All right, so let's look at differences in cortical thickness. So you can see this study was actually done on ADHD, autism, and neurotypical brains. And it was really interesting to see that the neurotypical brains and the autism brains looked very similar in terms of cortical thickness. But the ADHD brains had reduced cortical thickness in a variety of areas. Okay. So let's talk about the difference between gray matter and white matter. So gray matter makes up 40% of the brain. So this is where all of the neurons that function to remember and process language and see things are located. And so gray matter can be like a city with lots of different communication happening in small areas. And then white matter is like the highways between the cities. So the white matter connects the communication with the gray matter. We can edit that out. Okay, so this is a comparison of gray matter volume between ADHD brains and non-ADHD brains. And so you can see there's 62 milliliters less volume of gray matter in the ADHD brain. That's about 2 ounces. And 40-ish less milliliters of volume of white matter. So put together, total brain volume is less in the ADHD brain than the non-ADHD brain. So our brains are a little bit smaller. And this is brain volume in the amygdala. The amygdala is our emotion processing center. And you can see until adulthood, the amygdala is smaller in ADHD brains than non-ADHD brains, which probably explains our emotion dysregulation issues. Are you impressed? Are you a little bit sad? Yeah, right? Are you beginning to feel some empathy and compassion for the ADHD brain and the ADHD struggle? Yeah. So let me show you the differences in neurochemistry in the ADHD brain. All right, so information is transmitted from neuron to neuron through chemicals called neurotransmitters. And neurotransmitter transmission is like a key fitting into a lock. So every neurotransmitter has its own unique key, and a receiving neuron has its own unique lock. And so that neuron will only receive a neurotransmitter that it has the correct lock for. So there are more than 50 neurotransmitters, but what we know about ADHD is that dopamine and norepinephrine are the 2 neurotransmitters that are most highly implicated in ADHD brains. So the sending neuron releases the neurotransmitters, the receiving neuron catches the neurotransmitters, binds to that neuron, and then it stimulates it. So in this diagram, you can see that the pink little balls, those are the neurotransmitters that are crossing that synaptic gap. All right, so what happens in ADHD? Well, we know that it's a problem with dopamine and norepinephrine, but we're not completely sure what the problem is. So there are 3 possibilities. The first possibility is that there's a deficiency in the amount of transmission from the sending neuron. So the sending neuron is not sending enough dopamine or norepinephrine. The second possibility is that the receiving neuron has trouble catching it. And the third possibility is that the sending neuron sends enough dopamine and norepinephrine, but then it sucks it back up before the receiving neuron can catch it. So those are the 3 possibilities that we know to explain why the ADHD brain has trouble with dopamine and norepinephrine. So these are some of the functions of dopamine and norepinephrine. And so we think of dopamine as being responsible for motivation and reward and the pleasure response. But it also improves attention and focus. And norepinephrine actually reduces distractibility. It helps with executive function and memory retrieval and reaction time. So these are super important neurotransmitters for everyone, not just ADHD brains. Look at my branded cup, y'all. It's a what? So my friend Donisa said, "Do you want something to drink?" And I said, "Yeah, I would love some iced tea." And she comes back with a branded iced tea cup full of iced tea. Thank you, Donisa. Many of you know that I have dysautonomia. So my autonomic nervous system doesn't work properly, and it regulates saliva production, so I'm always thirsty. I tell people I've been thirsty since 2001. So it's actually a miracle that I only have 1 drink up here, because sometimes I have 2. Okay, so let's talk about the difference in how people with ADHD accomplish tasks compared to people without ADHD. Okay, so if you don't have ADHD, you say, okay, I need to do the most important things first, and then the next most important things, and I really want to accomplish things that have a reward. Okay, that's how a non-ADHD brain accomplishes tasks. Well, the ADHD brain, because of these deficits in dopamine and norepinephrine, the ADHD brain is not motivated by importance. All alternatives look the same. We pay attention to everything. Everything. So ADHD is not a lack of attention. We have too much attention. Everything is important. So we pay attention to all of it. It's named wrong. All right, have you ever heard a person with ADHD tell a story? So my son, Evan, was participating in some video filming yesterday, and he walked in the door, and I knew that 2-minute story was going to take him 26 minutes to tell. And it did. But my stories take 26 minutes to tell because I want to make sure that you have all the details. And the reason that I want to give you all the details is because I think they're all important. I can't rack and stack which details are the necessary ones versus thinking that they all need to be told. My boss asked me a question last week, and it was a 46-line reply, which really required 2 words. 2 words. He didn't need to know all of that, but I wanted to make sure. He got all the important stuff. All right, so the ADHD brain is different. So what now? What do we do with it? Right, we know that it's different. We see difference in structure and volume. We see difference in blood flow. We see difference in electrical activity. We see differences in connectivity from brain area to brain area. So what do we do about it? So I want to talk about 5 pillars of ADHD. These are 5 things that influence how the ADHD brain functions, the level of symptoms we see in ADHD, and how we can maximize function in the ADHD brain. There is no cure for ADHD, but we can do things, lifestyle changes, formal interventions, that give the ADHD brain hope of functioning in society. Okay, so the first one I want to talk about is sleep. Sleep. So elementary age kids should get 9 to 12 hours of sleep. Teens need 8 to 12. But kids with ADHD are notorious for sleep deprivation. Yes? Yes. So kids with predominantly hyperactive type of ADHD suffer more from insomnia. And kids with the inattentive type typically go to bed later. And kids with the combined type of ADHD have both insomnia and late onset sleep. Well, we just talked about dopamine. So lack of sleep actually reduces dopamine sensitivity in the brain. So lack of sleep means parents have less sleep if the child has less sleep. But if we have a lack of dopamine sensitivity in the brain, then we're going to struggle even more with that reward response and motivation. All right, so let's talk about why sleep is so important. During the day, toxins build up. As we use neurotransmitters to think and learn and function, as we use them up, they leave behind toxins. And so sleep is like putting our brain through a car wash. When we fall asleep, it's like a valve. Our brain shrinks just a little, and cerebrospinal fluid goes whoosh. Everybody say whoosh. Right, and cleans the brain. There's actually some really cool new research that says that beta amyloid protein buildup is cleansed through sleep. Fascinating. Sleep also consolidates memory. What we learn during the day is then committed to long-term memory during sleep. And sleep deprivation reduces our capacity for regulating our emotions, which is a hallmark of ADHD, and we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. But sleep deprivation leads to moodiness and irritability and reduced frustration tolerance, hyperactivity and impulsivity. And so when we're seeing these behaviors, or they're our behaviors, we have to say, how much sleep is our child getting? How much sleep are we getting if we have ADHD ourselves? Sleep. Okay, here are some tips for improving sleep in ADHD. So first, sleep can be maximized by sleeping in a cool, dark, quiet room. Sleep experts say that our temperature of our room should be in the 60s. And then everybody goes, oh, that's so expensive. I say that too. But that maximizes the best sleep. Okay, screens off an hour before bed. The blue light from screens actually tells our brain not to produce and release melatonin. And melatonin is that hormone that says it's time for your body and brain to go to sleep. For kids, it's super important that they have an unhurried bedtime. Parents of kids with ADHD are exhausted by the end of the day, and they cannot wait for the kids to go to bed, yes? Right. But if we include the bedtime routine as part of our day, as part of the time that we have to connect with our kids, then it will help them fall asleep more easily. Rather than go, 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 their brain hasn't had time to slow down. So an unhurried bedtime routine for kids. And then try to keep the same sleep schedule all the time. That melatonin production will get into a pattern that maximizes sleep. I often suggest that parents ask the pediatrician whether melatonin supplements could be a good idea. And then sometimes people need cognitive behavioral therapy insomnia. CBTI. Right, very few people realize that there is a special type of cognitive behavioral therapy specific for insomnia. All right, let's go on to our next pillar, nutrition. All right, I want to be clear that I'm not talking about diet. We don't want to aggravate or feed eating disorders by calling it a diet. I want to talk about nutrition in terms of the types and quality of foods and supplements that we and our kids are eating. All right, so food allergies and food sensitivities, those symptoms can actually mimic ADHD symptoms, particularly inattention and brain fog. But not only can they mimic them, but they can exacerbate them. So undiagnosed food allergies or food sensitivities are important to recognize when you are trying interventions for ADHD and they're not completely successful. All right, so two of the most common are dairy and gluten. So I'm going to talk about dairy first. So my best friend is a neuroscientist. She's the smartest person I know. She's been through 3 doctoral programs. But she has an allergy to dairy. And I know when she's put cream in her coffee. And you know how I know when she's put cream in her coffee? Because she can't form full sentences. Her brain fog is so bad because she has a dairy allergy. So we can't even have a conversation. All right, so why is dairy a problem? Even if you don't have an allergy or sensitivity to dairy, dairy is inflammatory. It causes inflammation in the body. And if the body is inflamed, so is the brain. And so neuroinflammation impedes neurotransmission. So our neurons have a more difficult time communicating with one another if the brain is inflamed. Research actually shows that the antibodies produced to dairy when someone has a dairy allergy, those antibodies actually poke holes in the myelin sheath. So the myelin actually protects the neuron. And if it has holes, you can imagine that it could create difficulty in communication between the neurons. Right. All right, let's talk about gluten. All right, there's a growing body of research on the neurological manifestations of gluten sensitivity and ADHD. So ADHD symptoms are actually overrepresented in people with gluten sensitivity. And for some gluten-sensitive people, the antibodies produced by gluten exposure can actually impact neurotransmitter release and the function of the neurons. So what looks like brain fog and inattention could be a gluten allergy or sensitivity. I'm just going to push this and let it spin and spin. Okay, let's talk about pesticides. So there was this really interesting study with 1,100 children, and those with higher levels of pesticides in their urine were twice as likely to have ADHD. Twice as likely. So research shows that this pesticide exposure impacts dopamine receptors. So if we choose foods that are not being treated with pesticides, organic foods, it may reduce the symptoms of ADHD that we're seeing that are being intractable to intervention, or actually help prevent it in the first place. All right, I want to talk about sugar. So we talked about inflammation a minute ago. Sugar creates inflammation in the body. When the body's inflamed, what else is inflamed? The brain, right. So there was this cool study at University of South Carolina, my alma mater, go Gamecocks, and they concluded that the more sugar that hyperactive children consumed, the more destructive and restless they became. And then another study conducted at Yale showed that high sugar diets increased inattention in some kids with ADHD. So some studies show no correlation between sugar and ADHD symptoms, but sugar is inflammatory. So even if we don't have ADHD, sugar can create inflammation in the neurotypical brain as well. All right, and I'm going to talk about food dyes. So there was a recent meta-analysis that looked at all of the studies on artificial food dyes and ADHD since 1990. And 87% of those studies showed an association between food dyes and ADHD symptoms. In Europe, do you know what color M&Ms are? Brown. Yeah, they're white, whitish brown, because food dyes are either illegal or limited. Wonder what they know that we don't know. Okay, let's talk about omega-3 fatty acids. So omega-3 fatty acids are actually good for the brain. We need them for strong myelin. And they're important for cardiovascular health as well. But what research has showed us is that deficiencies in omega-3 fatty acids result in misshapen dopamine receptors. And that when we supplement with omega-3 fatty acids, those dopamine receptors normalize. So if we know that dopamine is an issue in ADHD, then we need to test for omega-3 fatty acid deficiency so that we can supplement with it, so that we can maximize the ADHD brain's ability to catch that dopamine. So remember, that's the receiving neuron that has special receptors, that lock that only fits dopamine. If it's misshapen, it's not going to be able to catch it. And gummies, omega-3 fatty acid gummies, don't actually have enough fish oil in them. Right. So it needs to be a liquid or a pill, capsule. All right, here's some tips for nutrition in ADHD. Test for food allergies and sensitivities. Avoid pesticides. Avoid food dyes. I like to say that we should follow a 90-10 rule for sugar. 90% of the time, we limit sugar. 10% of the time, eat cake. Yes. Yes. Right? And then test for gluten sensitivity, or consider just not eating it. It's my opinion that no one with a brain should eat gluten. Do you know why? Gluten binds to neurons. They got to communicate. Why are we making it harder? And finally, supplement with omega-3 fatty acids. All right. Now we're going to talk about emotion regulation. Kids with ADHD have big emotions, yes? Yes. So emotion dysregulation is a hallmark of ADHD, but it's rarely talked about, and it's not even included in the diagnostic criteria. Makes no sense, but it isn't. Remember I showed you the connections to the prefrontal cortex are abnormal in ADHD, and that the amygdala is smaller in brains with ADHD? This would contribute to that emotion dysregulation. A majority of kids with ADHD and teens and adults also have something called rejection-sensitive dysphoria. And this is extreme emotional sensitivity or pain that's triggered by the perception of rejection, criticism, or failure. The perception. The word dysphoria is Greek for unbearable. So this emotional response that kids and teens and adults with ADHD can have to perceived failure, to perceived criticism, to perceived rejection can look like full-blown depression, can look like suicidal ideation and rapid cycling bipolar when it's this rejection-sensitive dysphoria. So research shows that a third of people with ADHD report that it's their most debilitating symptom. Can anyone relate to this? Yeah. So if I feel like I've disappointed someone, I will spin and spin and spin and spin. So it can be debilitating. All right, remember that the ADHD brain cannot distinguish what's important from what isn't, right? It's all important. Well, that means that the ADHD brain cannot distinguish between dangerous threats and minor problems. Everything is a crisis. Everything. So here's what the survival mode looks like in all our brains. So our brains have this amazing threat detection system. So the amygdala is constantly looking for danger, that tiger in the bush behind us. It's the watchdog, it's that fear detector. And when it detects something dangerous, it signals the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus triggers the release of adrenaline and cortisol to prepare us to fight, flee, or freeze. And so once this occurs, the reasoning part of our brain goes offline. We can't think and we can't learn. So if you're familiar with the Hulk from the Avengers, here's an analogy. When we're in our rational state, we're capable of using our prefrontal cortex to reason, and when our amygdala senses a threat and it takes over our brain and our body, then we become the Hulk. And when we're flooded and in Hulk brain, we can't make decisions. In fact, all of these things happen to us, right? We need these adaptive changes to maximize our survival. And keep in mind, while this is happening, the ADHD brain can't tell the difference between an actual threat and something minor. Everything is that tiger in the bush. And so our heart rate increases to pump more blood to our muscles so that we can fight or run. Our hair stands up. You know why? To make us look bigger. We sweat because it makes us slippery so that the prey cannot grab a hold of us as easily. Our pupils dilate so that it improves our vision. And interestingly, our middle ear changes so that we can only hear low-frequency sounds, like that tiger rustling in the bush. We can't process language. It's called auditory exclusion. So when we are in Hulk brain, when we are in fight, flight, or freeze mode, we cannot process what people are telling us. Calm down, no. There's a tiger in the bush behind me. When we're yelling at our kid, they can't process what we're saying if they're in fight, flight, or freeze. If our spouse is yelling at us because there's a fireworks explosion in our closet because we're disorganized with ADHD, we might not hear it. Kids with ADHD can be like fire. Can anybody relate to seeing this huge emotional response in their ADHD kid, and it feels like it's a fire. What they need the most is for us to hug the fire. They can't regulate their emotions, so then we have to co-regulate their emotions through a process called mirror neurons. There are these smart cells in our brain. Have you ever yawned and somebody else looks at you and yawns back? Those are mirror neurons. They kick in. They work best with people who you're close to, who you have a relationship with. And so when we're calm, our child's fire, those mirror neurons can kick in, and we share our contagious calm. We have to hug that fire and coach them through that storm. All right, here are ways to do that. And this, even if you don't have an ADHD child, if you work with ADHD kids, here are some ways to help them calm. We lower our voice, we soften our facial expression, and we relax our posture. We stay near to them on their level. We can dim lights, lower the sounds, help them name what they're feeling. And we can also model some breathing and grounding exercises, which I'm going to teach you now. The important thing to remember about co-regulation of emotions is it can't happen if your kid is in another room. So when we send our fire to their room, it just burns. We can't co-regulate from another room. Hugging that fire is hard. Okay, here are some emotion regulation practices that help all brains, not just the ADHD brain. All right, we're going to talk about breathing, grounding, mindfulness, and overall nervous system regulation. So the first thing we're going to do is breathe, and this is just called the sigh. Cyclical sighing actually presses the brakes on the sympathetic nervous system. It activates the parasympathetic nervous system, which helps calm our body. And so we're just going to take a breath in, and our exhale just needs to be longer than the inhale. Ready? So when we tell kids take a deep breath, we're missing the critical piece. The exhale is more important than the inhale. Longer exhale. All right, next one. You're going to love it. It's embarrassing, but I'm going to do it with you. The vagus nerve is the longest nerve in our body. It starts in our brainstem, it goes into our pelvis, it touches every major organ system along the way, and it's responsible for that parasympathetic nervous system that presses the brakes on that fight, flight, or freeze response. When we can vibrate that nerve, we're so beautifully and intelligently designed. When we can vibrate that nerve, we can lower that fight, flight, or freeze response. So we're going to inhale, and on our exhale, we're going to say the word VOO in our lower register, kind of like a foghorn. You can touch your throat and feel it vibrate when we do it. Ready? VOO. You feel calmer already? Right. Peter Levine actually created that exercise, and I love it. Okay, we can also teach our kids and ourselves some mindfulness activities. Mindful eating, where we just put one piece of food in front of our plate, or on our plate, one berry, one piece of chocolate, one piece of cheese. Imagine that we've never tried it before. Hold it in our hand, smell it, taste it. Think about its texture, its temperature, what it feels like. We're just grounding those neurotransmitters that are misfiring into the sensory experience. We can also do mindful listening. Put on some music and focus on only one instrument. Or we can take a mindful walk and just listen for the sounds that we hear while we're walking. All right, this is my favorite. Super easy to do. You can do it with all the kids you work with or your own, or you can do it yourself. This is a sensory experience that lowers the temperature on that fire. So you're just going to say to the child you're working with or your child, hey, can I help you right now? Can you name 5 things that you can see? Look around, have them name 5 things. Can you name 4 things that you can touch or feel? Can you name 3 things that you can hear? 2 things that you can smell, 1 thing you can taste. And if they're not completely calm, you can do it all over again. Name 5 more things that you can see. So I have some sensory issues, and I cannot stand to have my toenails filed at the salon, but I like to get pedicures. So I have to do this exercise while she files my toenails so that I don't turn into Hulk brain. It works. All right, there's this cool thing called the mammalian dive reflex. Have you ever heard that if you throw your face in a bucket of ice water, it'll calm you down? You don't have to throw your face in a bucket of ice water. All you need is for something cold to touch the top of your cheeks where your orbital bone meets your cheekbone. And so these frozen masks, $5 at the drugstore, these frozen masks will do that. You put it on your face, on your child's face for 30 seconds, and it presses the brakes on Hulk brain. And then finally, pressure therapy. Pressure therapy activates that parasympathetic nervous system. It presses the brakes on Hulk brain. And so a lot of times we think about weighted blankets, but some people can't stand a full weighted blanket. It feels very constricting, but a weighted lap pad will have that same effect for many people. So a weighted lap pad on the lap or over your shoulders. I like the Minky Dot ones because it gives an additional sensory experience. I have one client in counseling who uses this through every session, even when she's not in Hulk brain, because the pressure therapy has this calming effect. All right, emotion regulation tips. Grounding exercises, co-regulating emotions for your child, breathing exercises, some mindfulness. There's nothing magical about the ones I showed you. You can Google grounding exercises, breathing exercises, and mindfulness exercises. But sometimes, kids will need therapy. Adults will need therapy to help regulate their emotions. And sleep. So remember, sleep deprivation impedes our ability to regulate our emotions, especially in ADHD. So sleep is one of those ways that we can increase our ability to regulate our emotions. All right, let's talk about the 4th pillar, physical exercise. Everybody go, oh. Okay, maybe it's just me. Raise your hand if you love to exercise. Note that mine is not up. I like to say I'm allergic to exercise, because I kind of am. All right, so physical activity is essential for the brain. And it has nothing to do with the size of the body. Studies are showing that there are improvements in ADHD symptoms immediately after 20 minutes of an intense aerobic activity. And the reason we think that happens is because aerobic activity releases BDNF, brain-derived neurotropic factor. And it's this protein that acts like Miracle-Gro for the brain. It helps repair neurons and grow new ones and new connections. It also increases the size of the hippocampus, which helps with memory. If you don't love exercise, green time has a similar effect, barefoot in the grass. Okay, these 6 particular activities require technical movements, error correction, and intense focus. So things like martial arts, dance, mountain biking, skateboarding, rock climbing, and gymnastics are perfect for the ADHD brain. All right, here's some physical activity tips. See, this is my shortest pillar since I don't like it. I just want to get through this one, right? Okay. Best thing to do when we work with kids or have kids with ADHD is to model the importance of physical activity and share those. Someone who knows me very well is still laughing. Okay. Make it part of your schedule and limit other activities during that time. Well, my kid doesn't want to go outside because they'd rather stay inside and play video games. Well, who's in charge of the schedule? provide active toys and equipment that create these invitations for kids that will want to participate. And think outside of the field. It does not have to be soccer or football. It can be those other individual activities that I showed you a minute ago. And then just set an expectation. Hey, in this family, unless you're sick or allergic to exercise, we exercise. Okay, shoo, we got through that one. All right, I want to talk about cognitive skills. Somebody in here mentioned that they work in the brain training industry? Yeah? All right, so you guys are going to love this one. So the fifth influence on ADHD symptoms is the strength or weakness of our cognitive skills. And cognition in ADHD is not just an attention problem. So even though it's called attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, we know that we actually have too much attention. But let's look at some other documented deficits. So we did this study, very large study, more than 5,000 children and adults with ADHD, and we created their cognitive profiles based on gold standard testing. And so we plotted their performance on individual cognitive skill tasks. And what we found was that working memory, long-term memory, and processing speed were actually more deficient than attention. So what that says to us is that interventions that only address attention are missing the boat. They're missing the opportunity to affect real change in cognition. So let's look at that. There are two parts to SMART. There's information storage and there's information processing. So information storage is that knowledge, those facts, school subjects, things that we've learned. Information processing is how efficiently we take in that information and do something with it. So skills like processing speed and reasoning, attention, auditory processing, visual processing. So I want to do a demonstration of what that looks like. So remember I told you a story at the beginning of my talk. And I told you I was going to ask you a question about it. All right, you ready? Yes. In 10 seconds, I want you to spell the name of the monkey backwards. Ready? Go. All right, it was Jefferson. Who got it? Wow, give yourselves a hand. All right, you guys must have strong cognitive skills, and the rest of you, you might need some brain training. Okay, I want to walk you through what you just did to make that happen. Okay, first, you had to remember the name of the monkey. That's long-term memory. Then you had to decide on a process for completing this task, right? So you had to engage your logic and reasoning skills. Most of you probably projected the word Jefferson in your mind or in the air, yes? Yes, that's visual processing. Then you had to manipulate the sounds and the letters associated with them in the word Jefferson. That's auditory processing. You had to remember which letters you had already said and which ones were coming next. That's working memory. You might have gotten frustrated with yourself, especially those of you with ADHD, so you had to engage your attention skills. And finally, I only gave you 10 seconds to do it, so you had to work fast. That's processing speed. So that seemingly simple game that we played, I asked you to do one thing. You engaged 7 different cognitive skills. Can you imagine if 1 or 2 of those were weak? What if your long-term memory was bad? Well, let's see, about 70% of you didn't get it. If your long-term memory is weak, you couldn't have solved that task at all, right? If your working memory was weak, you might have forgotten where you were in the word Jefferson. If your processing speed was slow, you might have needed more than 10 seconds to do that task? Well, these are the skills that we use all day, every day in thinking and learning. And so remember, I showed you this graph that kids and adults with ADHD have at least 3 of those 7 skills that are weak: working memory, long-term memory, and processing speed. And the prevailing wisdom is we treat attention when working memory, long-term memory, and processing speed are just sitting down here unaddressed. All right, so how do we improve all of these cognitive skills? Well, everybody should be playing games. You should have a game closet, a game shelf, games under your bed, games everywhere. And so these are a few of my favorites. We actually have a list of games and the cognitive skills that they improve. And so we'll give you a link to that list at the end of this. But kids with ADHD probably need more than games. They probably need a formal intervention, training for those cognitive skills. Games are fantastic for engaging cognitive skills, but for remediating cognitive skills, you probably need a formal intervention. And so that's where my clinical research is focused, on cognitive skills training. It's based on this idea of neuroplasticity, that the brain is capable of changing with experience. So in our Learning RX centers and Brain RX centers, that training is delivered one-on-one by a human, not by a computer. And that enables adjustments, it enables motivation, it increases self-efficacy. The number one predictor of therapeutic success is the relationship with the therapist. That's what research shows. So if we apply that to the cognitive training field, then the number one predictor of outcomes in cognitive training would be the relationship with a cognitive trainer. You can't have a relationship with a laptop or an app, can you? You need a human that can deliver more than 1,000 different cognitive skills training tasks that address weaknesses in each of those skills that we just demonstrated. A cognitive trainer that can individualize and personalize the intervention. Our programs are paced. Almost every single one of the tasks are paced by a metronome to increase intensity, to increase processing speed, and we also use a stopwatch to make you do it faster and faster and faster. And interestingly, what do the accommodations in schools look like for kids with ADHD? Quiet room, isolation, slow things down, preferential seating, say again, more time on tests, more time on assignments. Does the real world work like that? No, in the real world, we exist amidst enormous distractions. And so in cognitive training at Learning RX and Brain RX, we actually provide deliberate distractions. 2 ways. Our trainers will try to distract the clients while they're doing a task, doing something funny, singing a song, saying something offbeat. But then we also have environmental distractions. We don't put our students in a quiet room, right? They are training in a large area with other clients with lots of different metronomes ticking and lots of noise so that we can train attention amidst distractions, like the real world. And then, of course, we measure everything. We do pre- and post-assessments so that we can quantify that change. And then many kids with ADHD also have reading and math struggles as well. If their cognitive skills are weak, they haven't been able to adequately learn reading and math skills. So we can provide that remediation as well, delivered through that same cognitive training approach. And then what sets us apart is research. Since the 1990s, there's been 42 research studies conducted on this methodology, 17 of which have been published in peer-reviewed journals. And so I've been the lead researcher on many of those studies. And so it's important to know that when you're looking for an intervention for your child or yourself with ADHD, that you look for an intervention that has peer-reviewed research. Not research that supports that type of program, but research on that program. All right, so here are some tips for improving cognitive skills in ADHD. Play board games all the time. Choose those apps wisely and limit the amount of time that you spend on them. Get those cognitive skills tested. That's the best way to find out which ones are weak. And then consider cognitive skills training, something that addresses those multiple cognitive skill deficits that we've documented again and again and again in research. And you can get that at LearningRx centers in the United States and Canada, and at BrainRx centers around the world. All right, so the 5 pillars of ADHD: sleep, nutrition, emotion regulation, physical exercise, and cognitive skills. And so when you're working with a child, or you have a child, or you have ADHD, and you have been doing interventions, and those symptoms are still uncontrolled, ask yourself about deficits in these 5 areas. Think about ways that you can plus up functioning in these 5 areas. This is a message of hope. I always say that we are not stuck with the cognitive cards we've been dealt. So with some lifestyle changes and an intervention that targets more than just attention, you or your child have a recipe for hope. Thank you.